Say the word Vietnam to most people, and they will not picture a country. They will picture a war. Helicopters over jungle, a line of soldiers wading through a rice paddy in the rain. A photograph they have seen 100 times without ever knowing exactly where it was taken. For most of the last half-century in the West, the name itself became shorthand for a single decade, the one that ended in the spring of 1975, on the morning the last helicopter lifted off a rooftop in a city then called Saigon. But that decade was not the country, it was a chapter, and it was not even a long one. The median person living in Vietnam today is about 34 years old, which means the average Vietnamese citizen was born roughly a decade after the fighting stopped. They have no memory of the war at all. To them, it is something that happened to their grandparents. History, not life. And in the 50 years since, this thin strip of land has done something almost no nation its size has managed. It has gone from one of the poorest countries on the planet to one of the fastest growing. Its economy today is more than 30 times larger than it was 40 years ago. Its streets move on the backs of tens of millions of motorbikes. 8 million in its largest city alone, roughly one for every person who lives there. And in the very same decades it spent rebuilding from rubble, its forests quietly gave up animals that science had never once recorded. Living creatures no biologist had ever confirmed were real. So the country is older than the war that made it famous, stranger than the war, and far more alive. The real question is not how Vietnam survived one war. It is how a place that has been invaded, occupied, burned, and rebuilt for 2,000 years keeps managing to do it. And what it became, the last time the ashes were still warm. This is Vietnam. Look at it on a map, and it barely seems wide enough to hold a country. It runs more than 1,000 miles down the eastern edge of mainland Southeast Asia, curved like a long, thin question mark, bending around the coastline of the South China Sea. At its narrowest waist, you could drive across the entire nation in under an hour, 50 kilometers, coast to mountains. At each end of that curve sits a river and a flood of silt and a delta. In the north, the Red River, spilling out of the Chinese highlands into the broad plain where the country was born. In the south, the Mekong, ending a journey of nearly 3,000 miles by fanning into a maze of channels so flat and so fertile that it feeds half the nation. Between the two deltas runs a spine of mountains, the Annamite Range, green, steep, and in places still barely mapped. In the far north, the land rises to its highest point, Phan Si Pan, more than 3,000 meters up, a peak the Vietnamese call the roof of Indochina. One country, but ask anyone who lives here and they will tell you it is really three. The north, cool and old and serious, the ancestral heartland, the place that absorbed 1,000 years of China and never stopped being itself. The center, narrow and harsh and proud, where empires kept their capitals and the land gives up almost nothing without a fight. And the South, young by comparison, settled only a few centuries ago, warm, open, restless, the part of the country that faces outward toward the sea and the world beyond it. 3 regions, 3 temperaments, one impossibly long thread of land holding them together. To understand how this country keeps rebuilding itself, you have to start where it first learned how, in the north, in the delta of the Red River. Hanoi is more than 1,000 years old, and it does not let you forget it. In the old quarter, the streets are still named for the goods that were sold on them centuries ago. Silk Street, Silver Street, the Street of Tin, the Street of Paper. The buildings lean into each other, narrow and tall, their fronts barely wider than a doorway, because for hundreds of years tax was charged by the width of your shop front, and so the city grew the only direction it could: down, backward, inward. And through all of it, in the early morning, before the heat, before the motorbikes, the old practices continue. Tai Chi by the lake, incense lit at a family altar, a bowl of pho, beef broth simmered for half a day, eaten at a plastic stool on the pavement, the way it has been eaten here for generations. At the center of the old city lies a small lake, and on an islet in that lake, a single weathered tower. The Vietnamese call it Hoan Kiem, the Lake of the Returned Sword. The name comes from a legend nearly 600 years old. In the early 15th century, the story goes, a fisherman named Le Loi pulled a magic sword from these waters, and with it raised a rebellion that drove the occupying Ming Chinese out of Vietnam after 20 years of conquest. He became emperor and founded a dynasty. And one day, sailing on this lake, a great golden turtle is said to have risen from the depths and taken the sword back, because the war was won and a weapon was no longer needed. The Vietnamese have repeated that story for centuries: drive out the invader, then put the sword away and return to ordinary life. They have had a great deal of practice at both halves. You can still see that older Vietnam performed on water itself. In theaters across the delta, puppeteers stand waist-deep behind a screen, controlling carved wooden figures that skim and dance across the surface of a flooded stage. Dragons, fishermen, water buffalo, farmers planting rice. It is called water puppetry, and it exists nowhere else on Earth. It was born almost 1,000 years ago in these very rice paddies, when villagers, flooded out after the harvest, made theater out of the water that surrounded them. The flood became the stage. That too is a habit of this country, to take the thing that overwhelms you and make it into something beautiful. But few people walking these streets stop to consider what the Red River Delta actually is. It is the anvil on which the entire nation was hammered out. Settled before the time of Christ, it became the homeland of the Viet people. And for 1,000 years, almost without a break, it was ruled by someone else: China. From around 200 years before the Common Era, the Han Empire pushed south and swallowed the delta whole. For 10 centuries, the Vietnamese were a province of China. Their officials were Chinese, their script was Chinese, their taxes flowed north. 1,000 years is not an occupation. It is long enough to erase a people entirely, to dissolve them into the empire that holds them, the way countless other peoples were dissolved and forgotten. The Vietnamese were not dissolved. And the reason why begins with 2 sisters. The year is 39 of the Common Era. In the Delta, a Chinese governor has grown cruel and greedy, raising taxes on salt and on fishing, demanding more than the people can give. A local noblewoman named Trung, whose family has held land here for generations, speaks out. Her husband is arrested and executed as a warning. The warning fails. Trung does not retreat into mourning. She raises an army. Her younger sister, Trung stands beside her, and what they assemble is, even now, difficult to believe. A force said to number 80,000, drawn from peasants and aristocrats alike, and led, at its head, by 36 women, whom the sisters trained themselves as generals. One of those generals, by some accounts, was their own elderly mother. In a single year, this army storms 65 fortified towns. It drives the Chinese governor out of the delta entirely, and in the year 40, after 1,000 years of foreign rule, Trung is proclaimed queen of an independent Vietnamese state, ruling from her ancestral seat at My Linh, just outside present-day Hanoi. It does not last. The Han Emperor sends one of his finest commanders, the general Ma Yuan, with a seasoned, disciplined army. The sisters' forces, untrained, undersupplied, outnumbered, hold out for nearly 3 years. But in the year 43, they are defeated. Rather than surrender, the Trung sisters are said to have walked into the river where the day meets the red and drowned themselves at the place where their rebellion had begun. Vietnam fell back under Chinese rule that day. It would not be fully free again for another 900 years. And yet, remember those two sisters, because the empire that beat them is long gone, and they are not. There are temples to the Trung sisters in Hanoi to this day. A district of the capital carries their name. There are streets named for them in every major city, festivals held in their honor every spring. They lost their war. They won something larger and stranger that outlived the empire that crushed them. A story the Vietnamese have told themselves for 2,000 years, in every century that someone tried to take this land. The story that says, "We have been here before. We do not stay conquered." Vietnam finally broke free of China for good in the year 938, when a commander named Ngo Quyen lured a Chinese fleet into the mouth of the Bac Dang River. He had planted iron-tipped stakes beneath the water at low tide. When the tide fell, the enemy ships were impaled and trapped, and the Vietnamese destroyed them. 10 centuries of occupation ended on a falling tide. What followed were the great dynasties, the Le, the Tran, the Le, Vietnamese emperors ruling a Vietnamese kingdom, building the temples and citadels whose bones still stand across the north today. And when the greatest empire the world had ever seen came for them, they held. In the 13th century, the armies of the Mongols, who had conquered China, sacked Baghdad, and reached the edge of Europe, invaded Vietnam not once, but 3 times. 3 times they were thrown back. In 1288, a Vietnamese commander named Tran Hung Dao trapped a vast Mongol fleet in the Bac Dang River, on the very same water where Ngo Quyen had beaten the Chinese 3 centuries earlier, and with the very same trick, iron-tipped stakes hidden beneath the tide. The fleet was destroyed. Kublai Khan, ruler of the largest land empire in human history, never took Vietnam. Tran Hung Dao is honored as a national saint here to this day. In Hanoi, behind a quiet gate, sits the Temple of Literature, founded in 1070 as the country's first university. Stone tablets there, mounted on the backs of carved turtles, still record the names of scholars who passed the Imperial examinations nearly 600 years ago. For most of that history, the Vietnamese wrote in Chinese characters. But there is a reason you can read the street signs here today. A reason Vietnamese is the only major language in Southeast Asia written in the same alphabet as English. In the 17th century, European missionaries trying to learn the language devised a way to capture its complex musical tones using Latin letters and a dense scatter of accent marks. It was a foreign system, built for foreign reasons. The Vietnamese adopted it, found that it made reading far easier to teach, and turned it into the national script. It is part of why this country now reads at a rate above 97%, among the highest in the developing world. Once again, take the thing handed to you by an outsider and bend it to your own ends. This was the engine room of the nation, but the heart of Imperial Vietnam did not stay in the north forever. To find where its emperors made their last stand against time, you travel down the coast to the center, to a city built on a river named for perfume. Hue was the imperial capital of Vietnam for more than a century, the seat of the Nguyen, the last dynasty to rule the country from 1802 until the monarchy ended in the 20th century. Along the Perfume River, the emperors built a citadel modeled on the Forbidden City in Beijing, a walled city within a city with moats and gates and a great flag tower, and at its heart, a purple enclosure that ordinary people could enter only on pain of death. Scattered through the hills outside the walls lie the royal tombs, each emperor designing his own resting place as a garden of pavilions and lakes and stone guardians, a private world built to be enjoyed in life and inhabited in death. And in Hue, you can still hear the sound of that vanished court. It is called Na Nyak, the elegant music, the ceremonial music of the royal palace, played on zithers and flutes and drums for coronations and funerals and the great rites of state. When the monarchy fell, the music nearly went with it. It survived in the memories of a handful of aging musicians and was pulled back from the edge of being lost entirely. The world now recognizes it as a treasure of human heritage. The court that commissioned it is gone. The music it left behind still plays. But travel a little further down that coast, into the green hills near the central towns, and you find ruins that do not look Vietnamese at all. They look like something lifted out of India. Towers of deep red brick, crumbling now, carved with dancers and lions and gods, Sanskrit inscriptions cut into the stone, altars to Shiva. This is my son. And it was not built by the Viet, it was built by the Cham, the people of Champa, a Hindu kingdom that ruled the center of what is now Vietnam for more than 1,000 years, trading with India and the Arab world, worshipping gods the North had never heard of. Here is the contradiction at the heart of Vietnamese history. The country we call Vietnam was not a single people holding firm against the world. It was a northern kingdom that expanded south and absorbed everything in its path. In 1471, a Vietnamese emperor marched on the Cham capital and shattered it. Champa never recovered. Its temples were swallowed by jungle. Its language faded. Its people were folded into the country that conquered them. And so the towers of my son became something the Vietnamese had once been themselves, 2,000 years earlier under the Han. A civilization being slowly erased by a larger one. The descendants of the Cham still live in Vietnam today, tens of thousands of them. They are one of the country's 54 recognized ethnic groups. The temples they built still stand in that quiet valley, weathered, broken, but not gone. Remember those towers. Vietnam is full of peoples it absorbed and never quite digested. A few miles from the coast, downriver from those ruins, sits a town that the rest of the world fell in love with. And almost everyone who visits it gets it wrong. Hoi An looks like a place frozen in time. Lantern light on yellow walls, a wooden Japanese bridge 400 years old arching over a canal. Tailors who will make you a suit overnight the way their grandparents made silk for merchants who sailed in from China and Japan and the Netherlands. In the streets, women still move in the ao dai, the long, flowing national dress, a silk tunic split to the waist over loose trousers, fitted close and worn with a conical hat. At dusk, paper lanterns drift down the river and the whole town glows. But Hoi An is not frozen. That is the easy story, and it is the wrong one. 400 years ago, this was one of the busiest trading ports in all of Southeast Asia, a meeting point where Japanese and Chinese and European merchants lived side by side, each building their own quarter, their own temples, their own bridges. The town is a melting pot that solidified. Then the river silted up, the big ships stopped coming, and the trade moved elsewhere. Hoi An did not die, it simply kept living, quietly, for centuries, while the world looked away. The people lighting those lanterns tonight are not performing the past for tourists. They are doing what this town has always done, adapting to whoever shows up and making something beautiful out of it. The merchants once came for silk, now they come for the light. The town takes them in the way it always has. That is not a place trapped in history. That is a place that has never once stopped surviving.
To see how many Vietnams there really are,
You have to leave the coast entirely and climb. In the far north, near the Chinese border, the land folds up into mountains, and the mountains are carved. Terrace after terrace of rice paddies, cut into the slopes like contour lines, glowing green in summer and gold in autumn, flooded mirrors in spring. People have been shaping these hillsides by hand for centuries. But the people who farm them are not mostly the lowland Vietnamese. They are the Hmong, the Dao, the Tay, some of the 53 ethnic minorities who share this country with the majority Kin. The Kin make up around 85% of Vietnam. The rest, more than 14 million people, belong to dozens of distinct cultures with their own languages, their own dress, their own gods, scattered across these highlands and the Central Plateau. So who exactly are the Vietnamese? It is not a simple question. The country is a thread that runs the length of a coastline, gathering up peoples as it goes. The conquered Cham of the center, the Highland Hmong of the north, the Khmer of the southern delta, the Chinese of the cities. A single flag stretched over a dozen worlds. The remarkable thing is not that they sometimes pull apart. It is how often and how stubbornly the thread has held. And once a year, for a few days, that whole long thread pulls tight at the same time. It is called Tet, the Lunar New Year, and it is the single most important moment in Vietnamese life. In the days before it, the entire country is in motion. Hundreds of thousands of people leave the cities and stream back toward the villages they came from, on motorbikes and buses and overnight trains, because Tet is when you go home. Families clean the house from top to bottom to sweep out the old year. They settle their debts. They cook sticky rice cakes wrapped in green leaves, the same recipe their great-grandparents used. And at the family altar, they light incense and call the spirits of their ancestors back to share the meal. Because in Vietnam, the dead are not gone. They are simply elsewhere, and once a year, they are invited home too. It is, in a sense, the whole national character in a single festival. Honor what came before, clear away what is finished, then begin again, clean. A country that has had to begin again so many times has made an art of the fresh start. But the oldest parts of Vietnam are not in any city or village. They are written into the rock itself, and nowhere more dramatically than where the limestone meets the sea. In the northeast, out on the water, nearly 2,000 islands of limestone rise straight out of the green Gulf of Tonkin, sheer towers of grey stone draped in jungle, their feet undercut by the tides, drifting in and out of the mist. This is Halong Bay. The name means the Bay of the Descending Dragon, and the legend says the islands were formed when a great dragon, sent to defend the coast from invaders, thrashed its way to the sea and carved the mountains into the water as it went. Even the country's scenery, in the Vietnamese imagination, is a story about repelling an attack. Inland, a few hours south, the same limestone rises again from dry land, a place sometimes called Halong Bay on land. At Ninh Binh, the karst towers stand in flooded rice fields instead of the sea, and small wooden boats, rowed by women using their feet, drift along rivers that vanish straight into the mountains through low water caves. It is a softer, quieter landscape than the bay, but it is built from the same ancient stone, and it has been farmed at its feet for 1,000 years. And on one island, out in Halong Bay, lives one of the rarest animals on the planet. The Cat-Ba langur, a golden-headed monkey found on this single island and nowhere else in the world. By the early 2000s, hunting had driven it almost to nothing. Fewer than 70 were left. A handful of conservationists drew a line, fought to protect the last of them, and slowly, against the odds, the numbers began to climb back. They are still desperately rare, but there are more of them now than there were 20 years ago. A small, golden comeback on a single island in a country that knows something about coming back. That same limestone holds Vietnam's deepest secret. To find it, you go to the center of the country, underground. In a national park called Phong Nha Ke Bang, the limestone has been dissolving for millions of years. Rain, faintly acidic, seeping into cracks in the rock, drop by drop, over geological time, hollowing out the mountains from within. The result is one of the great cave systems on Earth, more than 300 known caves, with new ones still being found. And the largest of them is a place that until recently the outside world did not know existed. A local man stumbled onto its entrance in 1990, felt the wind and heard the river roaring up from the dark, and was afraid to go in. It was not properly explored until 2009. It is called Son Doom, Mountain River Cave, and it is the largest cave passage on the planet. How large is difficult to convey. The main chamber is tall enough to hold a 40-story building. A passenger jet could fly down parts of it. In two places, the ceiling has collapsed, letting shafts of sunlight pour in from far above. And where that light falls, something extraordinary has happened. A rainforest is growing. Inside the cave, trees 30 meters tall reaching up toward the holes in the roof. Ferns, vines, birds, monkeys, an entire jungle sealed inside a mountain, fed by sunlight from a skylight 100 meters overhead. The explorers who found it called that section the Garden of Eden. Deeper in, past the reach of any light, the cave holds creatures that have spent so long in total darkness that evolution has stripped them down. Fish with no eyes and no color, pale and translucent, navigating an underground river they have never seen. Spiders, scorpions, millipedes, more than 7 species found here and nowhere else on Earth, every one of them adapted to a world without a single ray of sun. Even the butterflies in this park include kinds that flutter through these passages and exist in no other place. Now hold that thought. A country revealing entire ecosystems the world had never catalogued, because it connects to something even harder to believe. Something that happened in these same mountains in the same handful of years while Vietnam was still digging itself out of war. In 1992, a survey team working in the forests near the Laotian border found a skull in a hunter's home. Long, straight horns, a face no scientist recognized. When they investigated, they confirmed something that almost never happens in the modern world. They had found a large mammal entirely new to science. They called it the sowler, a creature the size of a small cow with 2 parallel horns and white markings on its face, so rare and so elusive that it has been seen alive by researchers only a handful of times. Some call it the Asian unicorn, not for any magic, but because it is so nearly impossible to find. There are no sowler in any zoo on Earth. We are not certain how many remain. We are not certain they are not already gone. And the sowler was not alone. In the same decade, in the same Annamite Mountains, biologists confirmed not one, but several new species of large deer, muntjac, that had been living here unrecorded the entire time. Among the rugged forests of this range survives the red-shanked Duke langur, a leaf-eating monkey so vividly marked with its gray body and maroon legs that early naturalists called it the costumed ape. Think about what that means. In the 1990s, as a wounded country was rebuilding its economy from almost nothing, its forests were still handing the world animals it had never seen. The persistence of this place is not only in its people, it is written into the land itself, into mountains so dense and so isolated that life found ways to hide there for 10,000 years and is only now being found. In 2019, a camera trap deep in Phong Nha caught a blurred image of a horned animal in the dark. A leading Vietnamese forest mammal expert, Dr. Nguyen Xuan Dang, studied the photograph and judged there was a real chance it was a sowler. Proof, perhaps, that the ghost of the mountains was still out there. The world is still not sure, and there is something fitting in that uncertainty. A country that came back from the dead, watching for an animal that may have done the same. But persistence is not only a story about the forest, it is most of all a story about food. And to understand how close this country came to not surviving at all, you have to go to the place that feeds it. The Mekong Delta is barely above the level of the sea. It is the flattest, wettest, greenest place in Vietnam, a vast plain of rice paddies and water channels where life is lived on and around the water. Here, in some places, farmers harvest rice 3 times in a single year. At dawn, the floating markets gather. Boats heaped with pineapples and watermelons and dragon fruit, each one flying a sample of its wares from a tall pole so buyers can spot it across the water. The whole marketplace drifting and trading on the current the way it has for generations. Children paddle to school. Houses stand on stilts. The river is the road, the field, the market, and the larder all at once. This delta produces more than half of the country's rice. It is the reason Vietnam today is one of the largest rice exporters on Earth, feeding far-off countries it will never see. But here is the contradiction that should never be forgotten. This same delta, this same overflowing rice bowl, is the place where Vietnam once starved. In 1945, in the chaos of the final year of the Second World War, under French colonial rule and Japanese occupation, with crops requisitioned and transport broken, a famine swept the country. The estimates are staggering and imprecise because no one was counting carefully. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese starved to death. In a land that grew rice. In a country that, within living memory, could not feed its own people from one of the most fertile deltas in the world. The journey from that famine, from a nation where mass starvation was possible, to a nation that now ships rice across the planet, is the entire story of modern Vietnam, compressed into a single crop. The delta that could not feed itself now feeds the world. Remember that when we reach the end. It is not a coincidence. It was a choice made by a country that had run out of other options. The South, in particular, has a gift for inventing new things out of old ones. Near the Cambodian border, at Tay Ninh, stands the great temple of the Cao Dai, a religion founded in Vietnam less than a century ago, which fuses Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Catholicism, and Islam into a single faith, and venerates an unlikely roll call of saints that has included the French novelist Victor Hugo. Its temple is a riot of color, dragon-wrapped pillars, a pale blue ceiling scattered with stars, and above the altar, a single divine eye, gazing out over rows of worshippers in white. There is nothing else quite like it on Earth, because it could only have been assembled by a culture whose deepest instinct is to take everything that washes up on its shores and weave it into something new. Vietnam's other great export began with a single seed planted by a foreigner. In the cool highlands around Dalat, in the Central Plateau, the hillsides are covered in coffee. The French brought the plant in the middle of the 19th century, looking for a cash crop suited to the altitude. They could not have known what they were starting. Today, Vietnam is the second largest coffee producer on the planet, behind only Brazil, and the undisputed giant of Robusta, the strong, bitter, high caffeine bean. You can taste the result everywhere. Vietnamese coffee is dark and thick, dripped slowly through a small metal filter, then poured over ice and sweetened condensed milk into something closer to dessert than a drink. In Hanoi, they whip egg yolk and sugar into a warm foam and float it on top. Egg coffee, born in a time when fresh milk was scarce, now a thing people queue for. A French colonial plant turned into one of the most distinctive coffee cultures anywhere. And the coffee is not the only thing the French left behind that Vietnam made its own. On nearly every street corner in the country stands a small cart selling banh mi, a sandwich built on a French baguette, but a baguette gone light and airy, made partly with rice flour, split and filled with grilled pork and pâté, and pickled carrot and cucumber, cilantro and chili. It is colonialism turned into lunch. The French brought the bread to rule with. The Vietnamese kept the bread, threw out the rulers, and turned it into one of the most beloved street foods on earth. The country took what was imposed on it, again and again, and made it unmistakably its own. But we cannot reach the present without passing through the dark. And the modern darkness in Vietnam did not begin with the Americans. It began with the French. In the second half of the 19th century, France took Vietnam piece by piece and held it for the better part of a century. They built the grand boulevards and the opera houses and the railways. They also built the plantations and the prisons. Rubber, coffee, and rice were extracted for export, while the people who grew them went hungry. On the island of Con Dao, the French ran a prison so brutal that its tiger cages, small open-topped concrete pits, became a symbol of colonial cruelty across the whole of Indochina. When the Second World War ended and the French tried to return, the Vietnamese fought them for 8 years. It ended in 1954 in a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu, where Vietnamese forces, having hauled artillery up mountains the French believed were impassable, surrounded and destroyed a French army. It was one of the few times in the 20th century that a colonized people defeated a European power in open battle. France left, and the country was cut in two. What came next is the chapter the world remembers. A communist North, a US-backed South, and a war that pulled in the most powerful military on Earth. For more than a decade, Vietnam was bombed, defoliated, and fought over. More bombs fell on this narrow country than were dropped by all sides in all of the Second World War. Chemical defoliants, Agent Orange among them, were sprayed across the forests to strip away cover, poisoning land and people in ways that are still causing birth defects and illness today. Unexploded bombs remain buried in the soil, and they still kill, decades after the last plane flew home. Some of the most extraordinary resistance of those years happened, like the country's deepest wonders, underground. Outside Saigon, fighters dug a vast network of tunnels. At Cu Chi, some 250 kilometers of them, hand-carved passages barely wide enough to crawl through, with hidden kitchens, hospitals, and sleeping quarters buried beneath the earth. An entire underground world, dug by people who had decided they would live below the ground rather than surrender what was above it. No one knows the full toll of the war. The most cited estimates put Vietnamese deaths in the millions, soldiers and civilians together. Whole villages were erased. And it does not need a silver lining. It does not need to be resolved into a lesson. Sometimes, the most honest thing is to let the weight of it sit and to say plainly, this happened, and it was vast, and the people it happened to are the same people who built everything that comes next. Because something does come next, and it begins, as these things so often do, in a city that the war was named for. On the 30th of April 1975, a tank crashes through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, and the war ends. The city that emerges is exhausted. The country around it is shattered. For the next decade, Vietnam is one of the poorest nations on Earth. Isolated, embargoed, its economy strangled by central planning so rigid that the rice-growing South, of all places, cannot produce enough to eat. By the mid-1980s, inflation is running at hundreds of % a year. People are leaving by boat, into the open sea, willing to risk everything because staying offers nothing. This is the bottom. This is the ash. And then, in 1986, the country does something its rivals across the communist world could not bring themselves to do. It changes its mind. The policy was called Doi Moi. It means simply renovation. Under a reformist leader named Nguyen Van Linh, the Communist Party kept its grip on political power but let go of the economy, dismantling collective farms, legalizing private business, opening the doors to foreign investment and trade. It was, in essence, a bet that a country could stay one thing politically while becoming something entirely different in its markets.
The bet paid off on a scale
Almost no one predicted. In 1985, Vietnam's entire economy was worth around $14 billion. 4 decades later, it is well over $460 billion, more than 30 times larger. In 1990, around 6 in 10 Vietnamese lived in poverty. Today, that figure has fallen into the low single digits. Life expectancy has climbed from the 60s into the mid-70s. Literacy is above 97%. A country that within living memory could not feed itself now stands among the top exporters of rice and coffee on the planet and has quietly become one of the world's factory floors besides. A large share of the smartphones sold under one of the planet's biggest electronics brands are now assembled in Vietnamese plants. The shoes and clothing of household name labels are stitched here. Circuit boards and components flow out of its industrial parks toward America and the world. The country the world once wrote off as a battlefield had become, within a single generation, one of the places that builds the modern world's machines. Stand in Ho Chi Minh City now, the official name of Saigon, and the change is not an abstraction. It is a roar. At a single intersection, hundreds of motorbikes surge forward at once, a flowing, weaving, impossible river of them, the whole city seeming to move on 2 wheels. 8 million motorbikes in this city alone. Glass towers rise where the war left rubble. On the riverbank where, half a century ago, refugees once crowded onto boats to flee, there now stands Landmark 81. For a time, the tallest building in the country, a needle of glass and steel, more than 400 meters high, lit up over the same water people once risked their lives to cross. And it is not only Saigon. Up the central coast sits Da Nang, a city that during the war held one of the busiest military air bases on Earth, its long white shore nicknamed China Beach by the troops stationed there. Today, that same shore is lined with resorts and high-rises. A bridge shaped like a golden dragon breathes real fire over the river on weekend nights. The airbase has become an international airport, flying in tourists and investment, and the city sells itself, without a trace of irony, as one of the most livable in the country. The front line became a postcard, and some of those who fled have come back. In the chaos after 1975, more than 1 million Vietnamese left by boat and by any means they could find, scattering to America, to Australia, to France, building new lives far from home. For years, the country they left behind treated their leaving as a wound. Now, their children return as tourists, and their savings return as investment. The money sent home each year by Vietnamese living abroad runs into many billions of dollars, quietly helping to build the very country their parents once risked everything to escape. The boats that carried people away from the ashes now, in a sense, carry something back. And on those bikes, in those towers, in the cafes, in the factories, and the startups, is a population in which the clear majority were born after 1975. a generation for whom the war is not a wound, but a chapter in a textbook, who look not backward at what was lost, but forward at a country aiming to become a high-income nation within a single generation. Even now, the country is remaking itself again. In just the last year, the government merged its 63 provinces down to 34, slashing layers of bureaucracy in the largest administrative overhaul since Doi Moi began. The economy grew by around 8%. The leadership talks openly of joining the world's largest economies, of a developed Vietnam by the middle of this century. And it is worth being honest, here at the height of the story, about what has not been undone. The poison still sits in the soil from the defoliants, and children are still born harmed by it. Unexploded bombs still wait in the forests. There is real worry that the country may grow old before it grows rich, its young workforce aging as the boom matures. Political freedom has not opened the way the markets did. The ashes are not entirely cold. They never fully are. But measure it against where this country began. A delta ruled by China for 1,000 years. Two sisters who lost their war and won 2,000 years of memory. A king who returned his sword to a lake. A kingdom absorbed, a famine survived, a colonial empire defeated, a catastrophic war endured. And then, from the very bottom, a deliberate decision to begin again. The fall of Saigon was not the end of the story. It was the line between two halves of it. And the country on this side of that line is the one almost no one outside Vietnam ever learned to see.
There is a thing people who study this place sometimes say,
and it is worth saying plainly. The world remembers Vietnam for the wrong decade. It built its entire picture of this country out of 10 years of footage from a single war, and then stopped watching, just as the real story was about to begin. It never saw the rice come back. It never saw the cities rise, or the bikes fill the streets, or the Sauler step out of the dark. It kept a photograph and mistook it for the whole country. But the Vietnamese never had that luxury. They could not stop at 1975 because they had to live in 1976 and every year after. They have been doing this for 2,000 years, taking the worst that history can do to a place and then, quietly, without waiting for the world to notice, beginning the long work of building it back. The Trung sisters knew it. Le Loi knew it when he gave the sword back. Hoi An knew it. The delta that starved and then fed the world knew it. It is not a miracle. It is a habit, the oldest one this country has. So the next time you hear the word Vietnam and reach for that old photograph, try to remember what it leaves out. 1,000 miles of coastline, 54 peoples under one long flag, a jungle growing inside a mountain, an animal that may still be out there watching from the dark, and 100 million people, most of them young, living in the country their grandparents rebuilt from the ashes, not because they were promised it would work, but because here it is simply what you do. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey, take a breath and stay a while.